Iran is entering what many analysts describe as the most fragile and dangerous moment in the history of the Islamic Republic. From the crowded streets of Tehran to the religious stronghold of Mashhad, millions of protesters have poured into public squares in an unprecedented display of defiance, chanting slogans once considered unthinkable: "Death to the dictator!" and "Death to the Islamic Republic!" What began as outrage over soaring food prices and a collapsing currency has rapidly transformed into a nationwide rebellion against decades of political repression, economic mismanagement, and systemic corruption. Despite the regime's aggressive attempts to isolate the country from the outside world by cutting off internet access and international phone lines, the demonstrations have not only continued, but intensified. Protesters have adapted, organizing through offline networks, word of mouth, and encrypted tools, signaling a movement that is no longer dependent on digital coordination. Security forces, stretched thin and increasingly exhausted, now face daily confrontations across dozens of cities, while reports of defections and silent resistance within state institutions continue to surface. Adding a powerful symbolic dimension to the unrest, exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has re-emerged on the international stage as a unifying figure for opposition forces both inside and outside Iran. His calls for a secular, democratic future have resonated with a population that has grown weary of clerical rule and unfulfilled promises. At the same time, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has responded with increasingly harsh rhetoric, warning of severe crackdowns and labeling the protests as foreign-backed conspiracies, a narrative that appears to be losing its effectiveness among a population facing daily economic despair. International reactions underscore the gravity of the moment. Former U.S. President Donald Trump has issued stark warnings about the regime's stability. European leaders have voiced growing support for the Iranian people, and Russia's notable silence has fueled speculation about shifting geopolitical calculations. As inflation spirals, the rial plunges, and the streets remain filled with defiant voices, Iran stands at a crossroads, with the future of the regime and the balance of power in the Middle East hanging in the balance. As the protests expand in both scale and intensity, Iran's internal crisis is evolving from spontaneous unrest into a sustained nationwide uprising with clear political demands. Demonstrations are no longer confined to major urban centers. They have spread to industrial towns, university campuses, oil-producing regions, and traditionally conservative provinces that once formed the backbone of regime support. In cities such as Isfahan, Shiraz, Tabriz, Avaz, and Kermanshah, protesters have blocked roads, staged strikes, and openly confronted security forces, signaling a collapse of fear that has long sustained the ruling system. Economic conditions continue to act as the primary accelerant. Inflation has surged to historic levels, wiping out savings and pushing millions below the poverty line. The Iranian rial has lost much of its value, while food prices, fuel costs, and housing rents rise almost daily. State employees, teachers, oil workers, and pensioners have joined the demonstrations, transforming what began as street protests into a broader social and economic revolt. Strikes in key sectors, particularly energy and transportation, are now threatening to paralyze large parts of the country's already fragile economy. The regime's response has grown increasingly desperate. Security forces, including the Basij militia and Revolutionary Guard units, have been deployed in large numbers. Yet reports indicate growing fatigue, coordination failures, and declining morale. In several instances, footage circulating outside the country shows security personnel refusing to intervene or retreating under pressure from crowds. Mass arrests, night raids, and intimidation campaigns have intensified, but these tactics appear to be producing diminishing returns as public anger deepens rather than subsides. Communications blackouts have failed to halt momentum. While the government has severely restricted internet access and international calls, protesters have relied on alternative methods to organize, including local networks, handwritten notices, and clandestine coordination across neighborhoods. The persistence of demonstrations despite digital isolation has exposed the limits of state control and highlighted the organic nature of the movement. Analysts note that once a protest movement can survive without centralized communication, it becomes far more difficult to dismantle. Politically, the crisis is beginning to fracture long-standing power structures. Public criticism of senior clerics and regime officials has become increasingly explicit, breaking long-standing taboos. Chants calling for the end of the Islamic Republic and the removal of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei now dominate rallies, replacing earlier reformist slogans. The emergence of Reza Pahlavi as a symbolic opposition figure has further unsettled the ruling elite, uniting disparate protest groups around a shared vision of systemic change rather than incremental reform. Behind closed doors, tensions are reportedly rising within Iran's leadership circles. Disagreements over how far to escalate repression, concerns about international backlash, and fears of internal collapse are fueling uncertainty. The silence or cautious positioning of key allies, combined with growing diplomatic pressure from Western nations, has amplified the sense that the regime is navigating one of the most precarious moments in its history. As protests continue day after day, the situation on the ground suggests a conflict no longer measured in hours or days, but in weeks and potentially months. With economic pressure mounting, public patience exhausted, and the security apparatus under strain, Iran's crisis is rapidly transforming into a defining confrontation between state power and popular resistance, one whose outcome remains deeply uncertain, but whose consequences will extend far beyond the country's borders. As Iran's unrest enters a critical phase, the country stands at a historic crossroads where the outcome will shape not only its own future, but the strategic balance of the entire Middle East. What is unfolding is no longer a temporary wave of dissent or a familiar cycle of protest and repression. Instead, it represents a deep structural confrontation between a population that has lost faith in the ruling system and a regime struggling to maintain control amid mounting economic, political, and social pressures. The persistence of the demonstrations, despite severe crackdowns and communication blackouts, has fundamentally altered the political landscape. Protesters have shown an unprecedented level of resilience, signaling that fear, once the regime's most effective tool, is no longer sufficient to suppress dissent. Each passing day of unrest further erodes the state's authority, while widening cracks appear within institutions long considered unshakable. The government's reliance on force, rather than dialogue, has only reinforced public perceptions that meaningful reform within the current system is impossible. At the same time, the absence of a swift resolution has heightened uncertainty across the international community. Global powers are watching closely, weighing their responses against the risks of regional instability, energy market disruptions, and potential refugee flows. Diplomatic signals remain cautious, but behind the scenes, contingency planning is intensifying. The possibility of a prolonged internal crisis or a sudden dramatic political shift has become a central concern in foreign policy circles from Washington to Brussels and beyond. For Iran's leadership, the choices ahead are narrowing. Continued repression risks accelerating internal collapse and international isolation, while any concession may embolden further resistance. This strategic dilemma underscores the regime's vulnerability. It faces a population unwilling to retreat and a world increasingly attentive to its actions. Meanwhile, opposition voices, both inside and outside the country, are gaining confidence that the current moment represents a rare opening for fundamental change. Ultimately, the events unfolding in Iran are testing the limits of authoritarian resilience in the modern era. Whether the crisis leads to transformation, prolonged instability, or a reassertion of state power through force, one reality is already clear. The relationship between the Iranian people and their rulers has been irrevocably altered. The chants echoing through Iran's streets today may fade or intensify in the weeks ahead, but their message has already crossed borders, signaling that a decisive chapter in Iran's history is being written in real time. As the world continues to watch, Iran's future remains uncertain, but the significance of this moment is undeniable. What happens next will not only define the fate of a nation, but also reshape the geopolitical contours of a region long shaped by its influence. Fear has unmistakably changed hands in Tehran, marking a dramatic and dangerous turning point in Iran's unfolding crisis. For decades, the Islamic Republic maintained control through intimidation, secrecy, and the constant threat of force. Now, that same language of fear appears to be echoing back at the regime. When authorities warned protesters with chilling statements such as, "We will hang everyone," the response from the streets was immediate and defiant. Instant revenge. What is emerging is no longer a conventional protest movement, but a shadow conflict playing out street by street, targeting the very symbols of state power once considered untouchable. According to multiple reports circulating both inside and outside Iran, homes belonging to senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, figures are being systematically identified and marked with red crosses, a signal that has quickly become synonymous with execution. In a stunning escalation, figures identified as General Keshavarz, described by opposition sources as a powerful drug trafficking kingpin within the regime, and Colonel Rahimi, were reportedly shot inside their own residences. These incidents, while difficult to independently verify in full due to media blackouts, have sent shockwaves through Iran's security establishment and shattered the perception of invulnerability surrounding its elite. The violence has not been limited to targeted killings, following statements attributed to exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, declaring that the instruments of oppression are legitimate targets. Anger on the streets appears to have taken on a more organized and radical form. Police stations in cities such as Babol and Hamadan were reportedly set ablaze, with crowds storming facilities long associated with repression, detention, and torture. In some cases, demonstrators are said to have freed prisoners, transforming symbols of state control into flashpoints of revolutionary defiance. What makes this phase of unrest particularly alarming for the regime is the apparent absence of a centralized command structure. Analysts describe the situation as a form of leaderless resistance, where decentralized cells and spontaneous actors operate independently, making the movement far more difficult to infiltrate or dismantle. The emergence of what some are calling a leaderless assassination doctrine suggests that fear is no longer monopolized by the state. It has become a weapon wielded by the population itself. As Iran descends into this new and volatile chapter, the boundaries between protest, insurgency, and revolution are rapidly blurring. With security officials now reportedly altering routines, abandoning official residences, and retreating into secrecy, the regime faces a reality it has long imposed on its citizens: constant fear, uncertainty, and the loss of control over the streets. The events unfolding point to a profound collapse of authority and raise urgent questions about whether the Islamic Republic can survive a confrontation in which fear itself has turned against it. As the situation on the ground continues to evolve, Iran's crisis is entering a phase marked by fragmentation, radicalization, and the erosion of centralized control. What began as mass demonstrations driven by economic collapse and political repression is now showing signs of a deeper security breakdown, in which the state's traditional monopoly on force is increasingly contested. Reports emerging from multiple cities suggest a shift from open street protests toward a darker, more covert form of confrontation, one shaped by fear, retaliation, and uncertainty on both sides. Iranian authorities have responded to the unrest with escalating threats and aggressive rhetoric, warning of executions and mass punishment in an attempt to reassert deterrence. Yet these warnings appear to have produced the opposite effect. Rather than suppressing dissent, they have intensified anger among protesters who view such statements as confirmation that the regime has abandoned any remaining restraint. Analysts note that when a government relies primarily on terror-based messaging, it often signals a loss of political legitimacy rather than strength. Amid this atmosphere, reports of targeted attacks on individuals linked to the security apparatus have circulated widely, though independent verification remains extremely difficult due to strict media controls and communication blackouts. Opposition networks claim that certain senior figures associated with repression and criminal activity have been killed, while the state has either remained silent or issued vague denials. This information vacuum has fueled speculation, rumor, and psychological warfare, a dynamic that further destabilizes an already volatile environment. Equally significant is the reported expansion of unrest beyond individual targets to institutional symbols of authority. Police stations, courts, and detention facilities, long viewed by many Iranians as instruments of repression, have become focal points of public rage. In several cities, crowds reportedly gathered around these sites, with some facilities damaged or set ablaze amid clashes with security forces. These incidents, whether isolated or coordinated, reflect a profound breakdown in the relationship between citizens and state institutions. Observers emphasize that one of the most alarming aspects for the Iranian leadership is the apparent decentralization of resistance. Unlike past movements that relied on identifiable leaders or organized groups, the current unrest appears diffuse, spontaneous, and highly adaptive. Without a single command structure, such movements are notoriously difficult to suppress, as arrests or assassinations fail to neutralize momentum. This decentralization also increases unpredictability, raising the risk of miscalculations and uncontrolled escalation. Meanwhile, signs of strain within the security forces themselves are becoming more visible. Reports of extended deployments, fatigue, morale issues, and internal distrust are growing. Some units are said to be rotating frequently or withdrawing from high-risk areas, while senior officials reportedly limit public appearances and alter routines. Whether these measures reflect tactical caution or deeper institutional anxiety remains unclear, but they contribute to the perception of a state increasingly on the defensive. Internationally, the developments are being closely monitored with rising concern. Governments and intelligence agencies are assessing scenarios ranging from prolonged internal instability to sudden political rupture. The prospect of a security vacuum in a country as strategically central as Iran raises alarms about regional spillover, energy market disruption, and humanitarian consequences. As a result, diplomatic engagement remains cautious, while contingency planning intensifies behind closed doors. As Iran moves deeper into this unpredictable phase, the distinction between protest, repression, and insurgent-style resistance continues to blur. The coming days and weeks are likely to test not only the endurance of the protest movement, but also the cohesion of the state itself. With trust shattered, fear circulating in all directions, and authority increasingly contested, the crisis is no longer merely about demands for reform. It has become a struggle over control, legitimacy, and the future structure of power in Iran. As Iran's crisis reaches this decisive stage, one reality has become impossible to ignore. The balance of fear that once defined the relationship between the state and society has fundamentally shifted. The Islamic Republic now faces a challenge far more complex than mass protests alone. It is confronting a profound collapse of authority, trust, and control that cannot be reversed through force alone. The events unfolding across the country signal not a temporary disturbance, but a structural rupture, whose consequences will shape Iran for years to come. The persistence of unrest, combined with the growing sense of unpredictability, has placed unprecedented pressure on the regime's security architecture. When institutions built on deterrence and intimidation begin to operate defensively, altering routines and retreating into silence, it reflects a deeper erosion of confidence at the core of power. This dynamic has created a dangerous feedback loop. Repression fuels anger, anger fuels resistance, and resistance further weakens the state's ability to govern effectively. Equally significant is the psychological dimension of the crisis. The perception, whether fully accurate or not, that state elites are no longer untouchable has had a powerful impact on public morale and elite behavior alike. In authoritarian systems, perception often matters as much as reality. Rumors, uncertainty, and the absence of transparent information have become forces in their own right, undermining cohesion within the ruling structure and amplifying public defiance. At the same time, the absence of a centralized opposition leadership presents both risks and opportunities. While decentralized resistance makes suppression more difficult, it also increases the danger of uncontrolled escalation and fragmentation, Without clear channels for negotiation or representation, the crisis risks drifting into a prolonged period of instability, where neither side possesses the ability to impose a definitive outcome. This uncertainty weighs heavily not only on Iran's population, but also on regional and global actors closely monitoring the situation. Internationally, Iran's unfolding turmoil is reshaping diplomatic calculations. Governments are preparing for multiple scenarios, ranging from gradual internal transformation to sudden systemic collapse. Concerns over energy markets, regional security, refugee flows, and the future of Iran's foreign policy posture are now central to strategic planning. While public statements remain cautious, the intensity of behind-the-scenes monitoring reflects the recognition that Iran is entering a historic and unpredictable moment. Ultimately, what is happening in Iran is not solely a confrontation between protesters and the state. It is a reckoning with decades of accumulated grievances, broken promises, and unaddressed crises. Whether the outcome leads to reform, transformation, or prolonged instability remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the old equilibrium has been irreversibly broken. The relationship between rulers and the ruled has changed in ways that cannot simply be undone by repression or rhetoric. As Iran moves forward into this uncertain chapter, the country stands at a crossroads where every decision carries profound consequences. The choices made in the coming weeks will not only determine the fate of a regime, but also redefine Iran's role in a rapidly shifting regional and global landscape. The world continues to watch closely, aware that history is unfolding in real time, and that its aftermath will extend far beyond Iran's borders.